Let me introduce a second theory of integration, the so-called federalism. And let me provide a definition of federalism first. So what the federalism is all about. So federalism is a system of government where the same territory is controlled by two levels of government. In other words, in one territory, there are two governments. So generally, a federal government is responsible for broader governance of larger territorial areas, while the subdivisions, in other words, local governments, govern the issues of local concern. Subdivisions, in other words, so there's a federal government and the central government and also the local governments. And both levels of governments have the power to make the laws, and both have the certain level of autonomy from each other. I'm not sure about you, but I don't know how much familiar you are with the American system. In America, the federal government is located in Washington, D.C., and also there are 50 local governments. They call it the state government. So each state has a governor. And in the federal government, in Washington, D.C., it has the national constitutions and laws and regulations. But each state, 50 states, have its own presidents, or they call governor, and its own constitution, laws, and regulations. So both levels of governments have the power to make laws, their own laws, and both have a certain level of autonomy from each other. So theoretically, the president of federal government has nothing to do with the governor of each state. They're not in the system of order. So president of government of the United States is not in the position to give order to the governors of the states. They enjoy a certain level of autonomy from each other. So when you hear about federal government, which country do you think of? I mentioned about the US, right? And perhaps Germany? Have you heard about the fact that Germany has the federal system? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And what about a small country in Europe, Switzerland? Switzerland has a perfect federal system. Now, when we talk about the federalism, we have to explain the early discussions of federalism in Europe. In Europe, European scholars discussed in early days mainly about the federalisms of civilized countries in Europe, only in Europe. Because the federalism was not known to non-European countries until 1960s or 70s. And later, they applied the federalism to non-European countries. And how come? How so? Why federalism became popular to many world populations? Why? Because of the two reasons. First, one of the smallest countries in the world, Switzerland. Switzerland has the successful application of federalism. So the experience of the Switzerland explains the merits of federalism. Even small country can have a successful federal system. Second reason is the experience of the United States, one of the largest countries. So in the United States, many scholars and politicians theorized the American federal systems. So in other words, the success of the largest and the smallest federal governments have attracted the people's attention. So now many countries, the leaders of many countries, politicians and scholars are thinking of federal systems instead of the centralized government system. In order to have federal system, we have to understand some basic assumptions. So there are 4 basic assumptions in order to achieve federalism. First assumption is that nation-state system hardly controls the international violence, nor accomplishes the welfare of human beings. Nation-state. What is the nation system? Literally, nation-state means one nation, one state. One nation, one state. After the 30 years of war in 1648 in Europe, it was the war between the Prussia and the Pope, Catholic Church. And after the 30 years of war, finally the Pope lost the war and allowed the new religion, which is the Prussia's new religion, not the old Catholic, but the Presbyterians or Methodists. And when they signed the treaty, they allowed to give a one state to one nation, one people. Nation means people. State means government. So one nation, the principle of one nation, one state was allowed by the treaties of the Westphalen in 1648. So during those days in Europe, big kingdoms had many different nations, different ethnicities, different races all together. So there was a series of conflicts in their kingdoms. So they decided to give one state to one nation. So they called the nation state. Nation state. So with this concept of nation state, each people wanted to maximize their interests over other nations, over other countries. And also it was the mid-17th century, the industrialization of the England spread to Western European countries. So it was the first time in European history that one nation, one group of people were put in one territory, and one country had successful industrialization than others. So they had a certain feeling of emotions. Okay, my nation, my people is more superior to other people. The so-called negative or exclusive nationalism was emerged. So nationalism was emerged and nationalism developed in order to manipulate other people for their nation's development. So nation-state system was made from 1648, and with this nation-state system, it is almost difficult, impossible to control international violence. So we have to mitigate or change, if not destroying, the nation-state system. So all the different nations can live together in the federal system. That's the one on assumptions. So in order to continue our our state system, it doesn't have to be one nation, one state system. Many nation, one state system could be possible. Second assumption is that all the government must submit to supranational authority. I told you about the American system. There are 50 governments, 50 state governments, and they submit to supranational authority, federal government in Washington, D.C. They yield certain areas of responsibilities to the federal government. And third assumption is that different opinions are beneficial for the goal. When you discuss about federalism or federal state, there are so many people talking about so many different things for their interest of their own sake. Different people, different groups, and different professions, and different religions, and different whatever you name it. So they talk about all the different opinions about the federalism, one supranational authority, but you have to consider those different opinions are beneficial for the goal. This is what the democracy is all about. Different opinions are very good for the process of the making the federal government. The last assumption is that human beings are rational. Human beings are rational. Human beings are not egoistic. So human beings are rational. So human beings are seeking for all the time harmony of interest. If my interest is in conflict with some other's interest, I have a rationality or which can transcend my own interest in reaching the common interest. So human beings are rational. Human beings are not egoistic all the time. So after all these assumptions are shared among the people, federalism might be easily applied. If not, it's going to be very, very difficult to achieve a federal government.